Joining us to discuss more of this is MS Now Washington reporter and The Weekend co-host Jackie Alemany, former Bush and McCain advisor Mark McKinnon, and Danielle Moody, co-host of the Democracy-ish podcast. Jackie, we should note we expect to see the president at any moment for a bill signing, but what's the reaction to this Times reporting there so far?
Yeah, Anna, and I expect that the president is going to be asked about this report in real time by reporters who are let into the room for that bill signing. So far, aides and people around Donald Trump have remained pretty mum on the really blockbuster reporting done by Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan and released this morning. And we know that the president has lashed out at our fellow colleagues, Joe Scarborough, Mika Brzezinski, and the crew of Morning Joe after they rehashed some of the allegations and some of the reporting that were made on air. And the president then took to Truth Social to launch a series of complaints and criticisms against them. I think an acknowledgement of some of the reporting, as Joe said himself, essentially a potential confirmation of the reporting that the New York Times has released this morning. But there are a series of unflattering depictions and anecdotes in here that I think really illustrate just how much this issue has plagued this White House, really, since Trump took office, and the lengths that aides and people around him have gone to try to inoculate and protect the president from some of the more disturbing and problematic claims and pieces of information that were inevitably going to come out in some way if the Epstein files were released. That has sort of become essentially a self-fulfilling prophecy or a vicious cycle in some ways, in that this is the news cycle that has never ended for them because of the lack of transparency. I think it's also revealed some fractures within this White House, which is something that they have sort of publicly, outside of the war in Iran, done a good job of preventing from leaking out there. But another issue that J.D. Vance has differed from Donald Trump on.
Right. It's so fascinating to learn from this reporting what Vance's reaction to the Epstein files saga has been. Since dating back almost a year ago, they report the vice president appeared panicked. Of course, we know Vance has never been fully in step with the president on this, but how is this revelation, plus what we mentioned of him suggesting Tucker Carlson interview Ghislaine Maxwell, how is it different than what we already knew about where the president and the vice president don't see eye to eye?
Yeah, I'm not necessarily sure that it's different, but I do think it's illustrative and revelatory about some of the frustrations that we and myself have also been hearing from senior White House aides about the fact that J.D. Vance lives online, that he is someone who is too online, too wrapped up in the MAGA online ecosystem, and that he does sort of propagate and buy into some of these conspiracy theories that in the case of the Epstein files has come back and created sort of a monster of its own to bite this administration back, not just politically, but also just sort of morally, if we are taking a step back and looking at this in an apolitical way. This is something that initially, this was a conversation that also cropped up again during some of the fractures that started to emerge during the Iran war. I was told by some senior aides that they felt like they were brushing off the criticisms from Tucker Carlson, Marjorie Taylor Greene, some of the MAGA online influencers, while J.D. Vance was sort of online reading them, and it was essentially fueling some of his private consternations about the war. So it's now, I think, certainly, again, illustrative to see yet another example of J.D. Vance's dive into the MAGA media ecosystem online and the way that sort of impacts his everyday job as President Trump's vice president.
Danielle, I could understand the strategy of trying to utilize MAGA media, but suggesting Tucker Carlson interview Maxwell, what's your reaction to that?
I mean, I think that it's incredibly shocking, but for me, what is most disturbing are the people that were in the Situation Room, and the way that Haberman and Swan started off their piece was stating what the Situation Room is actually used for, right? Like war and discussions of strategy around our foreign relations and domestic issues, et cetera. And the fact that so many of Donald Trump's top staff, cabinet members were in that Situation Room without him to discuss how to cater, right, how to create a PR a package for the Epstein files is incredibly shocking. But the idea that you would get Tucker Carlson to sit down with Ghislaine Maxwell, and Tucker Carlson, who has been at odds with this White House on a number of issues, is really just, it's extraordinary. But to me, the most extraordinary part is how many people were involved in the spin, in the cover-up, and in the lie that this White House said that Donald Trump had nothing to do with the Epstein files. And yet, these are not the actions that are taken by innocent people.
There's been just a drip, drip, drip of the Epstein files since the start of this administration. Mark, what's your big takeaway from what this says about the administration's apparent dysfunction and inability to handle a crisis?
Well, you drip right into my metaphor that I was going to use.
Mind meld.
Because, I did comms for presidents and candidates most of my adult life. And, the maxim was always, when you have bad news, the best way to deal with it is to get it all out as quickly as possible and being transparent. And this is just the worst case possible. This is like they had a dam or a reservoir full of bad news. And rather than just break the dam and let it blow, they have, as you said, let it drip, drip, drip. So we've gotten news almost every day since the beginning that's bad news. And the cumulative effect is way worse than I project, than suggest, than would have happened had they just let it all out at the beginning. But they're paying the consequences for it. And again, where will this story even end at this point?
Among the people inside the Situation Room was Todd Blanche, then Deputy Attorney General. And I want to read a portion about his role in these White House discussions. Quote, as the president's former defense attorney, Blanche had a unique vantage point in the discussion. He was better equipped than anyone else in that room to weigh the ideas being discussed against Trump's personal and political interests. Blanche laid out what he saw as their best options. One option he mentioned was to petition the courts to release grand jury transcripts. Another was to have DOJ lawyers interview Maxwell, which, of course, we then saw Blanche do. What ended up happening, obviously, has come from that. How did it all work out for them, Danielle?
I mean, I don't think that it worked out well. And here's something that I find really interesting. So in the article, right, they're discussing the fact that Todd Blanche, right, was offering up all of these options. And in them, pardoning her was on the table, right? Everyone pushed back, apparently. Well, some people in that room pushed back on a possible pardon because of what would happen if, in fact, she was pardoned, what would happen with their base. And they said that there should be no special treatment that is given to Ghislaine Maxwell because apparently they thought that she didn't really have any damning information on Donald Trump. But then Todd Blanche goes and sits down with her, moves her from a maximum security prison into a less security prison, right, where she now has more access to activities, to animals, to all of these different things. And so on one hand, they said, let's not pardon her because of how that will look. But then he turned around after that interview that he did with her and then decides to move her to a minimum security prison. This is a woman that was involved in trafficking children, right? And so, again, I think that what came out of this article are all of the ways, all of the options, all of the things that were being thrown at the table, but being thrown at the wall, but that were being led by folks inside of the Justice Department, namely the deputy and the Attorney General of the United States. And that in and of itself is incredible.
It does sound, according to this reporting, it sounds like Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche was given a huge role in deciding what to do about the Epstein issue. And now the president has nominated him to be the attorney general. Mark, what does it say about the power he wields inside this administration?
Well, one of the things we know about Donald Trump is that he was very unhappy with his attorney general from the first term, and that was something that he was going to change dramatically, so that he literally, and now he literally has his own personal attorney as the attorney general, which is what he's always wanted. So, and I think the whole, and it's so problematic to have that person at the center of so much of what's going on with the Epstein files. I mean, the whole issue of his interview with Ghislaine Maxwell and then the transfer to a minimum security prison. I mean, that just, you talk about quacking like a duck, that quacks like a duck. I mean, it's a duck, folks. How could it not be more obvious what's going on there? So that just makes it more problematic for his confirmation. But at the end of the day, I don't think Trump cares, because what he wants is the guy who's going to stand by and protect him through anything.